Well, thank you everyone for joining my session today. I'm really excited to be talking about how I'm able to leverage Ascend to basically maximize all of our data engineering efforts. So yeah, let's get started. So in today's session, I want to give an overview of just our landscape quickly, just to give some context about why I'm speaking about this topic and why I get so fired up about data engineering, and especially doing it with constrained resources. I want to then talk a little bit broadly about some of the organizational and technical constraints that startups face and why some of these projects sometimes just don't get off the ground or never get to completion. Then how do you then scale your infrastructure and accomplish more business outcomes with it, how we use Ascend.io, and some lessons learned throughout the process. So Brazen is a lean tech startup in the HR tech space. Our data engineering team consists of just me, which is a challenge in itself due to the number of components you do have within your data stack. So for us, it's really important that we're able to manage this entire process. And what our kind of stack looks like right now is, we've got data coming from many different sources, using Ascend.io to collect that, push it to our data warehouse, and using Sigma to do some of the end stuff. For us, it was really important to understand our business outcomes, and really what we wanted to do was focus on the internal BI piece of it, meaning like bringing data to business meetings, being able to check feature usage, doing all the stuff that runs kind of our daily business operations, and bring data to those meetings instead of having to make guesses to that. And so this has helped us tee that data up to do that. Another component of it too is we really wanted to get analytics embedded within our application so that customers could then see how they are using the platform. And we could leverage their data to show them about success about their events and other things like that. So like I said, because I'm the only one doing this, it's important that we've got these pieces here and that I'm able to manage all the pieces of this. And what I want to do next is just transition and kind of talk about a little bit about the constraints as a whole before we jump into how we kind of solve some of these things. And so when we talk about like a lean startup and we talk about the constraints that are faced with doing data engineering in this environment, we're talking about kind of three things from an organizational constraint. First, we've got tight budgets, we've got lean staff, and we've got competing priorities. Taken all together, what this really means is that opportunity costs are super high for a startup. Every dollar that you're spending on something is heavily scrutinized. Any dollar that you're using in one department means another department can't use that. And so it really goes to show that any dollar that you're spending has to be maximized in the activity that it's using. In terms of lean staff, some startups don't have anybody dedicated to the data project. They might have fractions of people's time dedicated to the project. Or if you're lucky enough, you've got one person who can dedicate themselves to the project. In terms of competing priorities, it's a startup, it's fast-paced, things change, every hour. You might get pulled into a customer issue, you might get pulled into a new initiative. Any of these things, it's projects evolve, timelines get blown up, and it can make for a challenging to get data projects off the ground. And so what often you can see is sometimes you don't even start a data project because none of these things are aligned to what you're trying to do. Product priorities might be the highest thing, but pretending that you've gotten past this, the team's been able to put some resources aside to do the project, that leads us in kind of the next number of constraints that you might experience at your startup. And so from here, you can jump into the technical constraints and some of the things that also prevent data projects from getting off the ground is large data sets. Software engineers are really good at putting the features in place, collecting the data about those things, collecting a ton of log data. And so we have a plethora of data, and combine that with the fact that storage is really cheap, which means that it becomes really easy to store a lot of this data. And what also happens is, because startups can change so quickly, you might add on a whole bunch of customers. If you double your customer base, for instance, that doesn't necessarily mean that your data doubles. It can go up exponentially for every single customer that you add. And so it makes it complicated and time consuming, and some of the traditional tools that we use to analyze data don't work as data scales. On top of that, another constraint you'll see is data coming from multiple sources. So as your team grows, you might have a CRM like Salesforce, you might have a ticketing system like Zendesk. You're going to have a number of third-party tools that you're using to run your business. And what that means is business questions get more complicated to answer, and questions might span multiple data sources. Like, you might want to see feature usage by industry. Well, the feature usage comes from our database, but our industry data comes from Salesforce. And so that makes it incredibly complicated, because now you don't have a single source of truth. You don't have a place where that data lives together to analyze it. And so you're having to export this stuff, put it in a spreadsheet, and do your analysis there. But what happens is, now you're doing that for every single analysis. And if you're doing the same types of analysis in different spreadsheets, you're likely going to have inconsistent calculations, and you're not going to know which spreadsheet's up to date. And so you're questioning the data. Take it all together from the technical constraint side, what ends up happening is, from a large data set perspective, you're having to make compromises on that data. You have to aggregate it to a smaller data set. You have to extract that as a CSV. Now you're going back to other third-party applications and extracting those as CSVs. You're using an Excel file or Google Sheets or whatever to bring all that stuff together. Every analysis is a new analysis, and you're maintaining a breadth of spreadsheets. In order to do this, you're unable to get past a lot of the basic business questions and basic operations because of the number of spreadsheets you have to maintain. And every single new spreadsheet just adds more overhead to your analytics team or whoever's maintaining that. And so now you're at a juncture where, these data initiatives are probably still important, and that's why it became a little bit of a mess. But you're tasked with the question, well, how do we scale this? How do we make this more efficient? Where do we go from here? And this is sort of where you enter the build versus buy questioning and decision making. And I'm putting here the main factors that traditionally go into the build and buy decision making. And on the first side of the equation is, a lot of the times why we choose to build, or why that we go down that route, is because of cost. And like I mentioned before, one of the constraints is cost. And when you're building it internally and you're looking at your path forward, you probably at this point have some sort of light infrastructure, light process, something to take care of these use cases that are right sitting in front of you. And it might not be that it might be a pretty low cost right now compared with an enterprise solution, which you're getting a lot more functionality, but you might not know how to use all that functionality. So the cost can seem disproportionate that way. However, what gets missed though in these discussions is considering these factors altogether, because in isolation, it might make sense. Okay, cost, I need to save on that. I have no room for that. However, what you can sometimes miss though is, if your use case doesn't scale well and all of a sudden you've doubled data or you've increased data, your budget might have just exploded just because of the fact that what worked for a very small data set doesn't work for a big data set. Now, additionally, because it doesn't scale well, now you have to put more maintenance on that. And you also might not have the expertise in-house to know exactly how to deal with all these different components. And so these things all of a sudden now add up to potentially even more cost than if you were to buy. And if all these things are slowing you down and you're not able to get to market, well, now this whole department has just turned into a cost center, and you're not able to recoup any of the cost on it. It's hard to put more money to the project if it's just looking like the money's just getting sucked out of the organization. On the other side, for the buying, what I think gets missed or not always understood or can get kind of confusing because of the breadth of vendors out there who all have different selling points. But for me, what's always really important is the time to market. How long can I, sign a deal or do a trial or whatever and get this into production and get this in front of customers? Because if you can, the shorter amount of time, if you can get something in front of customers in days, weeks, or a very short amount of time, and you can turn this into charging your customers for it or generating revenue from this, now you might be able to recoup the cost of this entire project with a couple of customers, and everything after that becomes revenue. And so now when you're looking at this perspective, you have an ROI that you can point to bring more resources to this project. And if it costs you tens of thousands of dollars to do this, but you're able to recoup that from a customer, does the cost matter that much? Because you've been covered. And so not only are you able to bring this stuff to market, recoup the cost for it, but if you're able to generate revenue off it, now you can even dedicate more resources to the project. And the other benefits that come with buying too is the fact that if you're buying from a vendor, typically they have some sort of scalable enterprise infrastructure. That's probably why they're in business. So they've got a proven architecture that at least you're told works. So that you get the expertise, you get the scalability, you get the integration, you get the maintenance with that. And so that's where I think in the landscape with today, and I'll go into some of the reasons why we chose Ascend in a second. To me, the buy use case has just become so much more in favor, and I think the scales have tipped because of how competitive and how these vendors are able to do some of this stuff at scale and really allow you to do this. So like I said, I'm talking to you as a customer of Ascend, and I'm talking from the perspective of we've had a ton of success with Ascend, and these are some of the kind of the practical reasons like why we chose Ascend and how it's fit our needs really well. If you go through a demo or you've seen the videos or you've seen how it works, what is really nice is the fact that you spend 100% of your time writing SQL or Python, or there's a couple other languages on there too, but from my perspective, these are what I'm using. You're focusing your time on the business logic. I don't spend any time figuring out cluster sizes or figuring out how to deal with this with large data sets. All I care about is talking to our business people and understanding what they need to get done, going to the source tables, getting that stuff in, doing the logic, transporting that, whatnot. I'm not focusing any of my time on the infrastructure. So that means that these activities are really focused towards creating value for our customers, because this is the stuff that if we get the data sets clean and the logic ready, we can get this stuff and get data that's ready for reports. So with Ascend, the infrastructure, we have it set up within our AWS environment, but they manage it for us. I mean, it's when we, after we signed the contract, I mean, we basically just spent, an hour on the phone and they set the infrastructure up for us. And it kind of just feels like you just shortcut this entire process of getting infrastructure set up, because we have that, we connect to our database, and then we're just kind of off and running. And what's nice too is that, like I said, I'm not having to pick cluster sizes, which, some people have made it easier to do, but at the same time, all that time you have to spend messing with infrastructure and poking dials and doing all that stuff just means it's taking away from the value added activities of creating reports and doing all that stuff for your customers. And so if I have a table with 10 rows or 10,000 rows or 10 million rows, I don't have to do anything. It literally will just, it might take a little bit more time to process because there's more data to go through, but Ascend automatically scales to that and gives it the right amount of resources. And so from a cost perspective too, I'm not sending tons of machines to handle a database table with 10 rows. I'm using very little resources to do that because Ascend knows what's going into that to do that. And so that saves me a ton of time in having to make all those decisions. Ascend's also been a single platform for our data engineering efforts in terms of just being able to get that data, transform it, query it, do all the complicated queries and push it somewhere. Even just understanding like if our data has changed or if something broke because the API changed or our database, we deleted a call, or even showing that kind of stuff helps me pinpoint the issues quickly. It shows me also which downstream, connectors might not be working. And so that has been a huge time saver in terms of just being able to pinpoint the issue. We have it set up where we get Slack alerts for this too. So I'm alerted with that. And also just being able to see how resources are flowing within our environment. Because once you get into more specific cases where now you're trying to do some sort of data manipulation for a customer, you know exactly how long that's going to take, how much that cost you. And so if you're trying to now build this to a customer, you have some sort of methodology you're using when you're going to that customer and you know how much it's going to cost you. And it's all that has just comes with it. And also from a lean startup mentality, the less amount of systems, the better, because it's just less overhead for us to maintain, and it's just less overall cost if we can just have it in one. And granted, too, at a lean startup, we don't have a breadth of different, data sources, and we don't have hundreds of data sources and hundreds of departments. It's all going to be pretty streamlined because of the, lower staff counts and just kind of simpler operations from that perspective too. So I haven't even had a need to just even go research other ways to do it because it works really great for us. You also get a team of data experts that you can talk to, which is great because if you ever tried to Google the stuff, it's hard. There isn't necessarily a Stack Overflow for stuff for questions that you have because some of the stuff is very like business oriented and very specific to your use case. I spent a lot of time with a lot of the folks on the Ascend side, just trying to understand like how to best optimize this stuff because Ascend does give you the platform to do it, but it's not necessarily plug and play. There's a lot of flexibility and a lot of really cool things you can do. And there's a lot of advanced topics, and having them just show you the best practices, again, just shortcuts a ton of effort and gets you to value faster. Ascend also has the pay-as-you-go pricing, which from a startup perspective helps a lot because the scariest thing is always contracts that are 1 year or multi-year because it always makes you nervous why you have to commit to something so long. Is this because now you've got a big window to do the onboarding to get that going? And to me, it just speaks to if there's pay-as-you-go pricing, they are reassuring you that you can get the time to value quickly and you're not locked into anything. And sometimes just the year contract or longer contracts can be scary because you have to fork over a lot of money without seeing value. Whereas the pay-as-you-go, we can prove the value as we're building this thing out. And so it just makes the hurdle to getting started much easier. Because like any product, if you had different expectations going into it, you're not locked in to a longer thing. And it just, to me, it speaks to the confidence that, they can do this pricing, even though it's easier for you to leave. And like I said, we got value. We had production pipelines going during the 30-day trial. And so for me, that's just again, we talk about time to market and seeing an end to the project. It was really clear how we can operationalize this. Now, outcomes for us or why Ascend has really helped us. This first point should be pretty obvious. It's kind of why Ascend is out there, but just speaking to the data analysts out there or anyone who doesn't have any sort of automation plane is being able to define a refresh schedule, whether that's daily or hourly or whatever, to pull from the source data and have that propagate through your pipelines automatically and push to the data warehouse. So you don't have to, go in and manually pull new data. It's always up to date as the last time you ran it. And so this means that you're not having to recreate your same report every time. You can just create one report that serves as the template. And as new data comes in, it's automatically incorporated to that. So a lot of stuff is you're just setting it up once to get the data from the source and then just letting it flow through. And again, it's an obvious point, but I think it bears mentioning that it works really well. And what this has meant is that now we can operationalize more reports and more data and have access to data internally. So we can bring data to every meeting. We can use data to influence product decisions. We can see feature usage. We can see where customers aren't using data. And so it helps us take this data, because we have Ascend, aggregating all this from all these different places, and now we can do and answer really complicated questions because we've got all the data from all different sources. We've been able to launch embedded analytics, and what's really cool about Ascend's not powering the embedded analytics, but it's obviously the plumbing that goes behind it. But our embedded analytics can be quite complicated, again, because you do have data coming from multiple different sources and lots of it. And so it helps us get that stuff together and get it in a clean state so that embedded analytics runs really smoothly for us. Your database is really optimized for your application. Turning it to analytics isn't always necessarily an easy switch. And so with Ascend, has helped us prepare that, get it in the data warehouse, have a really good launching point for our embedded analytics. And again, this is one of those, now we've turned this project into a product that we've actually released, which is showing the ROI for this. So, and I think this is really important to emphasize. We have some kind of other minor use cases where, again, because Ascend is aggregating all this data from all these different places, we can use Ascend to power functionality that sometimes we didn't have, or was a little bit complicated, or manually, pushing data around. So like, sometimes you need to have your contacts in a different system because you need to send email campaigns, or you want to have certain, product data points in Salesforce because it might make it easier to use, and things like that, just to help, do those operations or help that team run and carry out their initiatives a little bit more effortlessly. And kind of speaking to the last point too, but you do have a flexible environment with Ascend where you can run Python and you can run Python packages and you can enhance the data that you have already. And one way of that is simple stuff, even just like you've got a column with text and messages and you want to just run a sentiment analysis. You can pipe those things through a custom Python connector, or even just a custom Python transformation to add sentiment on that. And now you've got extra data now in your data warehouse where you can do more advanced functionality with it. You can call APIs in the middle of a pipeline to even enhance data that you have on here, or even just be able to pull data from even public data sets, or just anything that has an API, you can ingest into as one example of where you can get data from. So I want to transition for a second on and conclude with some of the things that I've learned along the way, and I think this is going to be kind of most relevant to anybody who's starting their journey out or is kind of in the middle of this and thinking about how do you scale your data engineering efforts and what that can kind of look like moving forward. So whether you build or you buy, selecting a vendor, selecting the resources, selecting the tools is a really big skill. Sometimes it gets overlooked in this position because there's a lot of focus on technical knowledge and Python and SQL and data science and stuff like that. But picking the right tools can also, or picking the wrong tools, I should say, can totally derail or stop the project from finishing. And building and buying isn't necessarily all or nothing. Some stuff you might build, some stuff you might buy. If you might buy the pipelines, but you might build the visualizations or something in your product. I've been a part of projects, or been a part of things, of data projects where sometimes you just pick the wrong vendor and you just never get off the ground and you're stuck in onboarding hell, and it's a year into this and you still have no value because nothing ever got configured correctly. It's super important to know how these vendors are going to enhance your business operations and how they're going to help you take the things that take your data and get the stuff to the finish line. And because there are so many, there are so many pieces to the data stack that it can be really critical that all these pieces work together. And kind of leads me to my next point of data questions need to be answered same day. Anything that you're introducing to your stack, anything should complement this, because what this is speaking to is if you look back before you got any of this started, or at the beginning of the project where you're just starting to get your initiatives off the ground, it's probably taking you weeks, months, or it's just not even accessible to do business questions or reports because of all the different constraints you have. If it still takes you weeks or months to answer questions, you haven't changed anything. You're in the same position you were before, but now you've just spent more money to do that. And I'm also highlighting this point too, because with Ascend and what we've got set up, we're able to do this. If I need to get new data from a table in our database, I can do that in minutes and get it sent to our data warehouse. And any vendor that you pick should be able to support moving quickly, because it costs a lot of money, again, to take a ton of time to get there, and building up a backlog limits your ROI in this project. And so the faster you can build stuff, get stuff out the door, the more ROI you can bring in, again, the more resources you have to fulfill the project. Another piece with this too, again, if you're thinking about growing your team, is with data engineering, the title, it's a great title, but it can be a little bit narrow in the sense that it isn't just doing the pipelines and the plumbing to support downstream things. You're wearing a lot of hats at a startup. And one day I'm building pipelines, the next day I have to describe methodologies on why I did a certain analysis one way. I'm creating visualizations and trying to pick the right visual or to tell the right story. With reporting, I'm trying to make sure that the team is equipped with the right reports that they have. I'm trying to get requirements from them and do different project management to determine which stuff to prioritize. You're working across the organization to understand all the different data needs. And so that can be really challenging, especially, one department thinks that their stuff's really important. So does another department. So does another department. And you have to contextualize all these things to understand what are the biggest ROI drivers. So there's a lot of other pieces to this than just the technical pieces. Start small, stay focused. One thing you have to be really careful of too is once you get, let's say you get Ascend going and you got a bunch of data sets in your data warehouse, it's really easy to lose sight of what projects and outcomes you were trying to do when you first started this endeavor. You might have started with because you wanted to get specific reports out to a customer. You might have wanted to do some better metrics reporting internally on some key features. But now that you've got the data in the data warehouse, it opens up a million different possibilities of what you can do with that. And if you are, and when you look at that, it can seem really boring to do the stuff that you originally set out to do. But I challenge you to just finish those and show the ROI initially, because otherwise what happens is you get caught up in all the shiny new, AI and machine learning and all these different cool things you can do with your data now, and you end up with a bunch of unfinished projects. And again, you're not showing ROI. And so, at least my last point, which I want to say is, I like saying this a lot, where you don't win an award for your architecture, you win an award for delivering value to your customers. And it's really important to keep focused on the activities that bring value to your customers. Building architecture can seem like a fun pursuit, but it's because there's so many vendors in the space, you have to consider the hurdle you have to go through if you do want to build this yourself. It can be fun to do this, but I'll say the skills have been, the data engineering and software engineering starting to have divergent skill sets, where the technology being used for both is changed rapidly, and sometimes it can be a fun coding exercise to try and figure out the architecture, but at the end of the day, we're really trying to deliver this value to our customers, and the more you can spend focusing on that, and the less you can spend recreating the wheel, the more value and the more ROI and the more success that you can have with this whole endeavor. So thank you, everyone. I hope that was entertaining, and look forward to any questions you might have.
All right, I'm back. Hey, Paul, that was great. conversation. Sure, everyone has taken a lot of notes on that. Remember our audience to post any questions on the right side of your screen. And we also put a poll question out there, kind of taking some of your content there, Paul, and seeing what are the biggest data challenges customers are having. Kind of, you listed 4, I put them out there to see what people think. So anyway, that's great. Okay, so let's get started. I have a question to get us started. So can you expand another level of detail on the onboarding process, specifically on the unexpected challenges and obstacles? Like, can you kind of help people, like, what were some other things in addition to what you talked about?
Yeah, no, the onboarding was fun with Ascend. I think there's a level of simplicity and there's a level of complexity at the same time. It's really cool to just like get your data sources connected and start rolling with it. But then there's a lot of really cool advanced functionality that I think when we were first starting out could be a little overwhelming, and it's ingestion and partitioning and all the different, it's covered in some of the more technical sessions that are upcoming, really like cool ways and best practices that, it's like I heard about, but seeing it implemented was challenging because there's just a lot of terminology that if you hadn't done this before can be a little overwhelming. But what was great is that you have great solutions architects to just help walk through this and get this set up for your initial ones. And I think once you do that, it quickly starts making sense kind of what they're doing. And so it didn't hinder the process. It made it like a really fun and like engaging like exercise in data engineering best practices.
Yeah, and I think with any tool that you get, there's that kind of you kind of almost lose a little bit of productivity as you're kind of learning the tool, understanding terminology, then you're going, now I understand partitioning, I can make that a little bit better.
Right.
Until you get kind of out of that valley, right, and start getting really accelerating. That's the part that we're looking in to help customers accelerate that so they can start getting the value part of it versus kind of in that learning phase.
And it's a trade-off too, because you could make a very guided, structured way of doing this, which helps you get going faster, but you lose all this end flexibility. And so for me, it's like, let's go through the learning curve and let's spend 2 weeks understanding partitions, because once you get that, it opens up a ton of flexibility and really cool use cases.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So let's see if we have any questions posted. So we have one posted from Khalid. Regarding the use of Ascend for ingest stage, how do you handle a variety in data?
Yeah. I don't know if it means a variety in data sources or just a variety in, I'm gonna go with the data sources one, because I think that's what it really, there's kind of 3 things. I think there's one was like setting up our like database connection, which is a little bit more involved just because it's your application data. The second piece of it is just the pre-built connectors that just come out of Ascend, which help just get the connection going, get data flowing through, like the Salesforce one we use a lot. And then there's the third piece of just there isn't something built, or we've got something custom, or we use some random small third party or something, but there's an API. And so sometimes it's going out and looking at if there's Python documentation for that. Like I'll use Zendesk as an example. It's like, there's a really good Python wrapper you can use to do that.
Right.
So that's one piece of kind of where the development can be with that. But once you ingest it, it's all kind of in the same format, and then you can do whatever you want with it.
Right. Yeah, and I think that the variety you mentioned, I think, are very common in what we see across customers. That you kind of have this different thing of custom things that you're not going to find a connector. Zendesk, there's a lot of connectors, and we're partnering with CData now, so we have a ton more connectors that we use. But there's also these like one-off systems that you have to get data from, right? No one's going to build a connector for that. So you have to figure out how do I get that data into the system so I can start using it. I think it's a pretty common challenge that people have, and we have the flexibility of the Python.
Yeah, and I will say too, even if there is a pre-built connector, sometimes you're trying to go beyond that. You're trying to do something even more custom with I want to ingest it in this certain way. I want to do like, I want to exclude these things. There's just sometimes you just want more levers to pull, and that's where the custom Python stuff just comes into. You can do whatever you need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and sometimes just getting that out of the box connector to get it going, right?
Get it going,
And
exactly.
over time, as you mature, you're like, okay, now I need to tweak it a little bit, right? And then you can, you have the flexibility instead of just being kind of locked into one way of doing it.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's awesome. So looking at our poll so far, we have 66% of people saying data from multiple sources is the biggest data challenge, and 33% of no single source of truth. So we're seeing some of that coming up. Okay, so I have another question for you. We still have a couple minutes here. What outcomes did you prioritize first with Ascend? Like when you got, I know you've worked with Ascend at a few companies, which we very much appreciate you seeing the value and introducing us to new companies. But how do you make those decisions?
Yeah. It's, you know, it's kind of when I go back to the build versus buy thing, it's like typically when you've got some process in place, and a lot of the times it's like, show me the Frankenstein Excel that is going on, and every company's got this. It's a monster Excel file that they're just doing stuff with, and it's like, okay, that's it. And it's mostly an internal use case because customer use cases are so complicated. It's like you have to have so many things in place, and it's getting the internal stuff can serve as a blueprint for the customer stuff. Like that, it feels like it kind of happens in succession. And so it's kind of like, let's interview all the departments, see what's going on, like find the analyst who's spending all their time managing an Excel sheet. What are you doing? And sometimes that also, once you get that data in a single place, it leads to other use cases that also use the same data.
Branches from there. Okay, great. Well, we're almost out of time. So I want to thank you for coming and joining us at the summit and providing some of your knowledge and experience to us. So thank you, Paul. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the opportunity.